Today's episode is brought to you in part by the recording label Tao Forums and their new album release entitled Revision. Revision is a collaboration between poet, scholar, 2020 MacArthur Fellow, and vocalist Fred Moten, and the virtuosic, double bassist and improviser Brandon Lopez. The work of each of these perceptive and creative artists concerns itself with navigating the present moment while simultaneously keeping humanity and sanity intact. Revision is a detailed studio recording which captures a full nuance of tone, both in Moten's voice and the exceptional range of sounds generated by Lopez on his bass. Revision is available on LP, CD, and download from Tao Forums, TAO Forums, a label which presents great work from both established and next-generation devotees of the music. Today's episode is also brought to you by Katie Go's Foreign Fruit, a bold and beautifully written memoir that begins as a simple curiosity into the origins of the orange and becomes a far-reaching odyssey, heralded by Catherine May as a sharp, sweet memoir of change, identity, and hybridity, and by Amy Key as an encounter not only with the orange, but with the reality of diasporic life in hostile environments. Foreign Fruit is simultaneously exploratory and intimate. Alongside the complicated history of the orange is Katie Go's own story, one of growing up queer in a Chinese, Malaysian, Irish household in the north of Ireland, and feeling at odds with the culture and politics around her. Yet over the course of the memoir, the orange becomes so much more to Katie than just a fruit. It emerges as a symbol, a metaphor, and a guide, encouraging readers to reflect on ideas of self, belonging, and the myriad forces that shape us. Foreign Fruit is out May 6th from Tin House and available for pre-order now. If you listened to the conversation with Omar El-Akkad earlier this year, you may remember me mentioning to him the book of today's guest and how it is a touchstone book for me this year, a book that has helped me more than any other in recent memory to imagine an otherwise, one that upends what we think of as schools and teachers, and where and how our writing and thinking could occur and be in relation to, and how this reorientation can not only affect our art making, but I also think our living altogether. Before we begin, I want to mention Leanne's contribution to the bonus audio. As you'll soon learn, Leanne is also a musician, and for the bonus audio, she gives us a sneak peek of a track from an upcoming album of hers. The song is called Murder of Crows, and the album, called Live Like the Sky, will likely come out this fall from You've Changed Records. This joins an immense and ever-growing archive with contributions from everyone from Dion Brand, Kinesia Lubrin, Christina Sharp, Naomi Klein, Isabella Hamad, Viet Thanh Nguyen, Natalie Diaz, Layli Long Soldier, Omar El-Akkad, and many others. And the bonus audio is only one of many things to choose from if you transform yourself from a listener to a listener supporter by joining the Between the Covers community. You can check it all out at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. And now for today's episode with Leanne Betasamosake Simpson. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest is the Michi Sagig Nishnabek scholar, writer, artist and musician Leanne Betasamosake Simpson, working for 2 decades as an independent scholar using Anishinaabeg intellectual practices. Simpson has over 20 years' experience with Indigenous land-based education. She studied biology at the University of Guelph, received a Master's of Science in Biology from Mount Allison University, holds a doctorate in interdisciplinary studies from the University of Manitoba, is the past director of Indigenous Environmental Studies at Trent University, and is currently faculty at the Dechinta Center for Research and Learning in Yellowknife, which provides post-secondary education using an Indigenous land-based pedagogy. As a musician, Simpson has performed across Canada, often with her singer-songwriter sister Ansley Simpson and guitarist Nick Ferrio. Her albums include her 2016 release of story songs Flight, and her latest record, Theory of Ice, which was shortlisted for the 2021 Polaris Prize, nominated for Pop Alternative Rock Album of the Year at the Summer Solstice Indigenous Music Awards, and was listed number 1 in Exclaim's 31 Best Albums of 2021. Simpson is the editor or co-editor of Lighting the Eighth Fire, The Liberation, Resurgence, and Protection of Indigenous Nations. This is an honor song 20 years since the blockades, an anthology of writing on the Oka crisis, and The Winter We Danced, Voices from the Past, the Future, and the Idle No More movement. And Simpson's own books include Dancing on Our Turtle's Back, Stories of Anishinaabeg Recreation, Resurgence, and a New Emergence, Islands of Decolonial Love, Stories and Songs, This Accident of Being Lost, Songs and Stories, which was the winner of the MacEwan University Book of the Year and named a Best Book of the Year by Globe and Mail, The National Post, and Quill and Choir. As We Have Always Done, Indigenous Freedom Through Radical Resistance, the novel No Piming, The Cure for White Ladies, shortlisted for the Governor General's Literary Award for Fiction, and most recently, Rehearsals for Living, co-written with Robin Maynard, with a foreword by Ruth Wilson Gilmore and an afterword by Robin D.G. Kelly. M. Norbesi Phillips says, in Rehearsals for Living, 2 women, one Indigenous, the other Black and African descended, confront their shared yet different experiences of colonialism. Unflinchingly, Simpson and Maynard weave their ideas, thoughts, and reflections and their deep caring for community and society through the network of issues that impact us today. Rehearsals for Living is fundamental to our understanding the interlocking founding crimes of the Americas, necessary for remembering the many erased histories of the ongoing struggle for justice, and altogether indispensable to those wanting to create possible solutions. Leanne Betasamosake Simpson is here today to talk about her latest book, out from Haymarket in the U.S. and from Dion Brand's Alchemy imprint at Knopf in Canada, called Theory of Water, Anishinaabe Maps to the Times Ahead. Here are thoughts about Theory of Water from 3 past Between the Covers guests. Christina Sharp says, placing her body on the shore, on ice and snow, in water, with cattails, bark, bullfrogs, and more, Leanne Betasamosake Simpson's attentive and scalar thinking demonstrates that what we do on a small scale is how we exist at the large scale. Billy Ray Belcourt adds, Simpson shows through an analysis of snow and water that already codified in Anishinaabeg philosophy is the blueprint to another world, one where solidarity in revolutionary struggle is always possible. A beautifully written ode to our capacity to resist state violence and imagine otherwise. Finally, Omar El-Akkad says, no writer in recent memory has more thoroughly rearranged my moral compass than Leanne Betasamosake Simpson, and no book brought me more solace than Theory of Water, Anishinaabe Maps to the Times Ahead. Amidst the cascading calamities of colonial and capitalistic violence, in which the prevailing power structures depend so fiercely on our diminished capacities for care and attention, Simpson has written an essential work on love as a methodology, and what it means to stand in solidarity with one another and with the earth that sustains us. This is more than just an imagining of something better, but a reminder that better has always been here, has always been possible. A book of immense regenerative power, written by one of the few truly incendiary, indispensable writers working today. Welcome to Between the Covers, Leanne Betasamosake Simpson.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here.
Well, it isn't coincidence that that theory of water opens with you out on the ice and snow, contemplating your own history as a skier, something you've done since you were 2, and also about the territorial experimental ski training program in the 1960s that provided an escape for Native peoples from the abuse of residential schools. And perhaps in a similar spirit, you say, in your words, that, quote, when it was icy, I could fly. That all your thinking happened out on the trail. That you wrote and skied, making connections on the trail that you could never make in front of a computer. And you say explicitly that your body of work exists the way it does because you removed yourself from the academy. And that this book comes through an escape hatch, one that seems to rhyme perhaps with this ski training program as an escape from the residential schools as well. And this is a long-standing belief of yours. If we go back to 2014, your piece Land as Pedagogy argues that a resurgence of indigenous political cultures and nation building requires a radical break from state education systems, and argues for a reclamation of land as pedagogy. So this feels like an important place to start, both hearing more about your writing and thinking process away from a desk while out on the land, but also about why this radical break from academia is important.
I think the radical break from the academy was important for me because I had a lot of difficulty fitting my intellectual and artistic and creative process into the boxes of the academy. So I had trouble confining my thinking to a peer-reviewed academic paper and those conventions. I had trouble coming up with an idea and doing a proposal or a prospectus and then writing the book. Whenever I did that, that was a guarantee that that book would not get written. So I really needed to find a way, I think, of being able to protect the part of me that can think outside the box and that can create. And that for me was outside of the academy. So that's one answer to that. Another answer is that I really fell in love with Anishinaabe thought and my own culture and my own land. And I wanted to place that at the center or the spine of my practice of not just writing and thinking, but of my life. And that meant spending a lot of time on the land with elders and my kids or with elders and students, letting elders sort of lead the way and being attentive to how they teach and how they're almost a conduit or a facilitator for how the land teaches. And so doing this for a couple of decades really, I think, consolidated this process for me. I was also always very, very involved in sports, but I was never very good at sports. And I think part of the reason I was never good at sports is because I was writing poetry in my head or I was thinking of ideas. Whenever my body is in motion, that's when I get a lot of ideas, or that's when I can work through things like writer's block. And so me on the ski trail is is me stopping and thinking and making notes on my iPhone or making connections that I can't seem to make at a desk inside an office on a computer. When I go back to Anishinaabe thought, though, and when I go back to our origin stories, this is all sort of very embedded in how knowledge and storytelling and sharing of that knowledge so that audiences and communities can feel like they belong to the stories. That's all sort of part of a bigger project that I love to be in the middle of. I think when I was thinking of the territorial skiers in the north, I was thinking about how sometimes I feel free when I'm out on the land running or skiing, and I sort of lose that little bit of awareness of where I am, and I start to be able to think outside, the confines of the present moment. And I know that Indigenous people often would escape to the bush as a form of resistance and a way of reconnecting and regenerating themselves so that they could go and face the violence of colonialism. And so it did seem like a good rhyme to start the book there.
Well, one paragraph in that 2014 essay that I particularly love reads, Nanabush is widely regarded within Nishnabek thought as spiritual being and an important teacher because Nanabush mirrors human behavior and models how to come to know. I think it's important to point out that Nanabush does not teach at a university, nor is Nanabush a teacher within the state school system. Nanabush also doesn't read academic papers or write for decolonization, indigeneity, education, and society, which, as an aside, is where this article I'm reading from was published. Nanabush is fun, entertaining, sexy, and playful. You're more likely to find Nanabush dancing on a table at a bar than at an academic conference. If Nanabush had gone to teacher's college, Nanabush would have been fired in the first 3 months of his first teaching gig. This is precisely why Nanabush is an outstanding teacher. Nanabush not only teaches me self-compassion for the part of me that may dance on bars in celebration of life and love and all things good, but Nanabush comes with inevitable contradictions held within the lives of the occupied. Nanabush also continually shows us what happens when we are not responsible for our own baggage or trauma or emotional responses. The brilliance of Nanabush is that Nanabush stories the land with a sharp criticality necessary for moving through the realm of the colonized into the dreamed reality of the decolonized, and for navigating the lived reality of having to engage with both at the same time. And in another place in that essay, you talk about the word theory and how theory within Nishnabek thought is generated and regenerated continually through embodied practice, that theory is woven within kinetics, spiritual presence and emotion, that theory is contextual and relational. So before we talk about water and the theory of water, let's just spend a moment with what you mean by theory. And by theory is kinetic, especially given that you cite explicitly ice and snow as your collaborators in this regard.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that one of the positions, the ways that Indigenous people and Indigenous thought has been positioned within a colonial framework is as less than. Our knowledge is less than Western science and Western knowledge. We are not as smart as non-Indigenous people. And so early on in my career, I became very interested in learning how, or trying to learn how to think with inside Anishinaabe thought. And I became very interested in thinking about Anishinaabe theory. And so I started thinking, a theory is an explanation for something. And how does theory operate within Anishinaabe thought and within Anishinaabe communities? And the first thing that I noticed is that it operates in a very horizontal fashion. It's not something that is just for, professors or theorists in the ivory tower. It's something that's for everyone. It's for all of our people. And it requires an engagement with story, an engagement with life, a certain kind of presence. And it requires an internal journey, I think, or a commitment or a responsibility to make meaning and to find meaning in the context of one's life. And so that's sort of in my culture, that's the responsibility of someone who is listening to stories or reading stories, is to find that meaning. And that became very interesting to me, to think of theory as something that's communal and that's a communal meaning making process. And it became interesting to me to try to think through our present moment through that lens. And what I came to learn very, very quickly is that I couldn't do that at my computer and through reading, because the people who are experts on that, who are elders, who are language speakers, teach through embodied practice. And this act of going out on the land, setting up camp with a group of students and a group of elders is a way of embodying that theory together. And as you sort of make something together on the land, it's an incredibly generative in terms of learning, in terms of what you're learning and how you're learning, and connecting that then to the stories that one's being reminded of how our ancestors traveled on a particular lake, or Nana Bush and or their interactions with a birch tree, sort of deepens that practice and deepens that understanding. And so, as a writer, I think I was always trying to figure out how to communicate the depth and the thickness of our knowledge and our stories through writing in English. And that's, I think, required some creativity on my part, some expansion of genres and disciplines in order to be able to communicate that. And I don't know that I've ever been able to do that successfully. I think that that's sort of a struggle that's common to Indigenous writers and Indigenous academics right now.
Well, when Natalie Diaz came on the show for the first part of our almost 5 hour conversation,
Beautiful.
her last collection focuses on water as well. And we talked
Yeah.
about how the Black diasporic experience so often is seen through water, and the Indigenous experience through questions of land, and how she was working, I think, against a reductive one-to-one correspondence in this way. In her piece, The First Water is the body. The body and the land are one and the same, and the river is a body, and the river is in her body. But thinking about your land as pedagogy a decade ago, and now your book, Theory of Water, which may or may not be two ways to say or look at the same thing, talk to us about what centering water does, what changes or is highlighted or foregrounded when moving from land as a lens to water as a lens.
Early on in my career, I was very focused on land. As many Indigenous writers and Indigenous academics and Indigenous people, our land is incredibly important to us. And because I think that I was coming to those questions through this Anishinaabe theoretical lens, I was adding water into that. So water is included in land. Then I started to think as land as a network, as a cascading set of interconnections and interdependencies that crossed different species, that crossed different kinds of humans, and that was propelled, I think, by what we call in my culture Minobamadzawin, or this continuous rebirth. So it involved cycling, it involved interdependence, it involved reciprocity, and I started to see it as this complex network that was expanding through time and space. And well, that's a very different understanding of land than the one that I would inherit from settler colonialism, that is a territory that has borders that are guarded, that is owned by people, that is property. And so using the word land in English in our current reality invokes property, it invokes borders. And I was talking about something very different. And so I tried to sort of articulate that in As We Have Always Done, and it didn't, it was a beginning. And then I kept thinking of this more deeply and more deeply. And then in my culture, water is very, very important. And it's often in our ceremonies in the realm of women. And I think that because I part of my work in my life has been to really trouble the gender binary and undo the gender binary, I didn't participate in a lot of the water walks, and I was more reluctant to get involved with the water is life sort of activism. But as I came to it at my own time, I started to think about what I could learn from water through its embodied practice. Here's the global water cycle that touches every form of life, every geography on the planet. Here is a being that's been here since the very beginning and that will exist, long after I exist. Here is Nibby that can change from a solid to a liquid to a gas that's constantly transforming. Here is water that is seemingly not powerful, and then you see a massive blizzard or a tidal wave or, running water washing away at a rock for tens of thousands of years and then cutting an arch or a chasm or a rupture. So I started to become focused on water as a teacher, as a collaborator, as a being that was teaching me to as Fred Moten says, violate my home spaces. It's inside of me, it's outside of me, it's connecting me to Palestine, it's connecting me to Sudan, and it's something that I interacting with every day. So it suddenly became this powerful teacher in a way of reorganizing the way that I was thinking about the world. And I think that was the motivation, I guess, for theory of water. I think it also requires me to think outside myself and to think outside my people because my territory is not attached to the ocean. So then I need Christina Sharp to understand the Atlantic Passage. I need Black feminists to understand what the ocean means. I need the Kanaka Moali to understand what the South Pacific means. I need the Maori. I need desert people to understand what a lack of water does. It requires a collaboration that's much bigger than me and much bigger than my people.
When Omar El Akkad was on the show a couple months ago, I was talking to him about how important his new book felt as a diagnostic, a book that's been described as a breakup letter with the West. But I was curious to understand better what he meant by the negative resistance that he suggested, what he called a walking away, which didn't necessarily mean moving anywhere else. I was curious because I was having trouble picturing how to walk away while remaining deeply enmeshed and complicit within the system. And I've long wondered and debated within myself whether it's enough to know what we are saying no to and what we're moving away from. For instance, I think of the Routiers and Dion Brand's A Map to the Door of No Return, these oral songs that served as navigational maps, and how for her it feels like these songs move the marooned diaspora away from centers of violence, perhaps towards a gathering place elsewhere. But as I discussed with Dion, the gesture seems to be one of escaping and exceeding what one is escaping. But as I was telling Omar, reading Theory of Water felt like a landmark breakthrough moment for me in my own understanding. It's the first time I felt like I could really imagine and picture what this world we would be walking toward could look like, and also what creating that world looks like as well. As a first step towards exploring this together, the world to fight for, and how we can be part of that, I wanted to first talk about the creation story you share in Theory of Water. Many of your books and essays and speeches center and orbit around a story. The story you tell in your scholarly essay, Land as Pedagogy, you call that story a theoretical anchor in that essay. And it feels to me like the creation story in Theory of Water might be a similar theoretical anchor for the book. And the elements of the story that most stayed with me have to do with the inevitability of imperfection and failure, and or the limits of individual action, and the power of collective action, but in a time frame that exceeds an individual life. The creator spirit who creates the world, that world goes awry. He gets assistance from the sky woman for a second try, but that is also flawed. And then at some point, water, Nibi, helps by flooding the earth entire. And then we have all these different animals that are stranded on the back of the turtle. There's no land, and each is diving down to try to bring up dirt with them, often dying in the process as they do, even if they float up with a flipper full or a paw full of dirt, not necessarily seeing what comes from all of their collective effort. But I'd be interested in hearing, what about this story of repeated failed creations by both spirits and animals compels you to possibly be anchoring your book in this way, but also more broadly, if you could talk about the role of story. For instance, when you say Nanabush stories the land, which feels like something important or central to this practice.
Yes. I think when I say Nanabush stories the land, if you're an Anishinaabe and you know a lot of Nanabush stories and you're out on the land, the forest, the rocks become almost a mnemonic device to remind you of those stories. So when you see Nanabush's footprints on the rocks in the Canadian Shield, there's a story about that links to one of the creation stories where Nanabush walks around the world, and I've used it to talk about Anishinaabe internationalism. When you see sphagnum moss, there's a story about how Nanabush's brother was not able to contribute to the community, and no one could figure out why. And so, over decades, the people carried him and tried to help and tried to get him to be able to give something back. And eventually, the spirits changed his brother into this sphagnum moss, which was very, very useful to the community. So there's all these reminders on the land of stories, and I've often said that the forest or the land is like a library, but it's more like a mnemonic device. It's a reminder of all of these connections and all of these stories. Um, Now, what was the first part of your question?
About the creation story that perhaps serves as an anchor for Theory of Water.
Right. So origin stories and creation stories are the big sort of meta theory in Anishinaabe thought. And I think a lot about them because they are often stories about how the world is made, or how Anishinaabe people have to figure out how to weave or knit themselves into the world that was already made. And because, like you, I'm thinking all the time about alternative ways of living together on the planet if one refuses racial capitalism and heteropatriarchy and colonialism and imperialism and all of those things. I'm interested in figuring this out. And one of the things that I think that I've learned from my people is that Anishinaabe people got up and they made things. We didn't rely on institutions in the past or banked capital. We got up and collaboratively made life and made the systems of life, whether that was our system of spirituality, our artistic practices, our transportation systems, our foodways, our clothes, our housing. All of these things were creative practices that were done collaboratively. And when I look back to those creation stories about how the world was made, it was never made by one person. It was never made the first time and worked perfectly. It was always a struggle. Making the world was always a struggle. Figuring out how to live in a good way with millions of other forms of life was always a struggle. And I often think in this present moment where we have genocides in Gaza, in Sudan and Congo, where we've got increased fascism in the global north, where a lot of my friends and comrades are really struggling with some horrific violence, I think of us sort of all on the back of that turtle trying to figure out how to live differently. And it's not Leanne's ideas, it's all of our ideas together and figuring out how to regenerate, how to take care of each other, how to meet the material needs of the life that we're on the back of the turtle with. I think there's a line in the book. Maybe they weren't even thinking of making a world right now. Maybe they were just thinking of meeting the needs of the people they were in commune with. And anytime we get together, whether it is at a protest on a Saturday in front of a Tesla dealership or whether it is in a land-based practice, when we get together and we make something together, that is a site of regeneration, or as Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, that is a rehearsal. That is us rehearsing and skilling up and figuring out collectively this next world. And for me, those are really, really powerful actions and powerful sites, and they're a way of generating theory from practice. And that's the kind of work that I think gives me hope. Not that we don't need people who can diagnose the present moment and who can link that to, the history of fascism and who can link that in a way. I think those people who do that work are very, very important. But I guess the poet and the dreamer of me is always on the back of that turtle trying to imagine a different way of living.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, we have a couple questions from others that aren't exactly the same question. Maybe not the same question at all. I'm not sure. But to me, they feel like two questions reaching toward a similar place. So I'm going to play them together
Okay.
in the spirit of these very different animals sharing the turtle's back and risking on behalf of each other for the future of everyone. Of course, if they do seem different to you, do feel free to speak to them as separate questions too. The first is from Omar El-Akkad. He's the author most recently of the book, One Day Everyone Will Always Have Been Against This, the book he came on the show to discuss, of which Christina Sharp said, "Here language does what we need it to do. It clarifies, it condemns, it names, it grieves. Here too is a lexicon for what might survive this. Devastating and scathing, you will want to read, will want to have read this book." And the second question, which I'll play before you answer either of them, is from someone who you discuss within Theory of Water, Alexis Pauline Gumbs, who describes herself as a queer, black troublemaker and black feminist love evangelist and an aspirational cousin to all sentient beings. Her most recent book is Survival as a Promise, The Eternal Life of Audre Lorde. But she also has a very water-centric book as well called Undrowned, Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Mammals, of which Danny McLean says, Alexis Pauline Gumbs pushes us out of our comfort zone and into the sea, where other species are moving and mothering in ways that can teach us how to survive. So here are kindred questions for you from Omar and Alexis.
Hi, Leanne. I have to admit, when David first asked me to submit a question for this episode, it seemed like the perfect way to communicate with you because I think every time we've been in the same room, I've been far too intimidated to actually approach you and say anything. So being able to communicate with you from a distance probably works well for someone as insecure as I am. I don't know that there's a writer alive whose work has been more comforting or instructive to me than yours. And I was sitting here thinking of all of the things I wanted to ask you about This Accident of Being Lost, which is my favorite book of the previous decade, about your work with Robin, about this new book. And I think I've sort of haphazardly settled on a question that I'm not even sure relates to craft or personal methodology, but it has to do with something that I find in all of your work, which is this incredible obligation to care. Every sentence, every concept, everything you approach has this immense duty of care. And I guess I wanted to ask you how you go about protecting that capacity for care, especially in a world where so many of the dominant systems of power seem to be predicated on this kind of ingrained carelessness, this inattention, this lack of desire to treat something with the respect it deserves. And so I really just wanted to know how you go about protecting and cultivating this care, this obligation of care that runs through all of your work that I've ever read. Thank you so much.
Hello, it's Alexis Pauline Gums. I am so grateful for your work at all times and in this time. And I wanted to think of a really smart question, and then I wanted to think of a really beautiful question. But then I just had to be honest that my question for you is what's on my mind and on my heart as I watch colonizing resource wars ramp up and continue, which is something that you speak to in this new work, in Rehearsals for the Living, in really all of your work. But I would love for you to talk about the wisdom that you have for how we protect the sacred, including water. Or maybe that's not the formulation. Maybe it's how the sacred protects us. Maybe the word protect is not doing what I want it to do. But I'm thinking about the sacred, the sacredness of water, and how to honor what we love when so much energy is being focused on turning everything into an extractable resource. So that's my question. It's a sincere question. And of course, it's not for you only individually to answer, but I respect and admire you so much as a guide. And I feel like even the slightest gesture from you could be so clarifying and illuminating for me and for us. So that's my question. Thank you always.
Wow, those are such beautiful, beautiful questions. That was very, very moving just to listen to the questions. I've had trouble trying to think up good answers to both of those. I think for Omar's question, at the center of Anishinaabe life is these 7 teachings that are often called the 7 grandfather teachings or the 7 ancestor teachings. And I wrote about them as a first try in Dancing on Our Turtle's Back. And I remember talking to Doug Williams, who's the elder that I worked with a lot for a couple of decades, and asking him in his office at Trent University how you say 7 ancestors or 7 grandfather teachings in Anishinaabe-Moan. And I thought that it would be the direct literal translation, and he thought for a long time, and then he said Kukum the Bajamawan, the grandmother stories. And I asked him why do you call them that? And he talked about how that's how his grandmother called them, and she called them that because children would learn these teachings about love, about bravery, about honesty, about truth from their grandmothers, and their grandmothers would tell them specific stories about people in their family who did an amazing job of embodying those teachings. And I thought that that was an amazing system of care. So almost wrapping young people in this blanket of stories that are seeds that they can carry with them through their life. They can think about, pull them out, find meaning, watch the meaning shift. But it also connects them to their family. It shows them leaders in their family, lots of different kinds of leaders. It shows the best parts of people that they're growing up with. I really loved that teaching, and I started seeing those teachings not really as teachings and not even really as laws, because sometimes they are almost get referred to like the Ten Commandments, like they're a kind of a rigid, you have to follow these laws or you're going to get struck down by lightning. But what these are is really a very gentle system of care. I work a lot in the north with Dene people who also have a similar set of Dene laws, which are about taking care of each other on the land. And so in my work at the Chinta last June, we brought my comrades Glenn Coulthard and Les and Kelsey Wrightson brought a group of Black, Brown, Palestinian, Indigenous folks to a camp outside of Yellowknife on the land for a solidarity gathering. But we knew that each one of the people that we had invited had had a very difficult year organizing, speaking out, going to protests, surviving genocide. And so we were thought very carefully with our team of elders and with our land-based team about what this group of people needed in this particular moment of time. And as we went through this week together, it became care. We fed them really well. We made sure everybody had a comfortable place to sleep. We tanned hides together. We fished together. We did ceremonies together. We rested. We laughed. We had fun kind of canoeing around together. And it became really, really clear to me how important taking care of each other is. Far more important than like the papers that we didn't actually ever read to ourselves, to each other. Um, but it became important because it bonded us to each other, because we created relationships. We created relationships of trust and intimacy, and we created a community. We built a community together and then lived in it. And so, yes, it became this generative side of knowledge, but also I think my hope is that we all kind of came out of that gathering feeling slightly better than when we went in. And that's actually what I want for my readers with Theory of Water. I hope that people are able to find like a little bit of solace, take a breath, and come out just a little bit better. And I think it is very important to find ways for writers in particular, to find ways of protecting the parts of themselves that can create. Because I think this world right now is really hunting down that kind of intimacy, that kind of vulnerability. And I think it's important to find ways of protecting that for sure. And then Alexis's question is pretty similar, but I think the way that we protect the sacred is we belong to it. And I think that by belonging to water and water belonging to me, we create this reciprocal relationality that's a system of care and that's nurturing and that I think can, in times like these, at least for me, can give me the wherewithal to go back out into the world and fight. And it's like a power up. And I think that it's important for all of us in this moment to find those things that calm us down, fill us up, make us feel connected, and give us the ability to dream beyond, even though we're in this current situation with so much violence and so much death.
Well, one of the ways you describe water in this book, one of the many ways you describe water in this book, you say it's iterative, resilient, transformative, interdependent, decentralized, a vessel for multitudes, always creating more possibilities, an emergent theory of internationalism. It works with and asks us to embrace uncertainty, multiplicity, adaptation. It's within us and connects us to all forms of life. But you also talk about something that I think speaks to what you've just talked about, this question about bonding and collectivity and belonging, called centering. And I agree with Christina Sharp when she says, Simpson gives us the word centering, which is what snowflakes do to bond in space and place. It is joining in deformation. It is transformation. It is an ethic of how to live. Centering should be a new word in all of our vocabularies for how to see and imagine ours and each other's linked presences and work in the world. Talk to us a little bit about centering, what exactly it is and what you see it modeling.
So one of the things that makes theory of water different than my other works is that my longtime mentor and elder, Doug Williams, has now passed away. And so I don't have this person, this Michi Anishinabek person who knows more about everything than me to go to all the time. I'm missing this mentor, I'm missing this teacher, I'm missing this kind of parental figure, friend, comrade. We did a lot of stuff on the land together. And so during the pandemic, I volunteered to become a groomer at the ski trail that's close to my house. And I was out on the trail a lot of times in the morning, packing down the snow so that skiers could come and ski on the trail. And one of the things that groomers pay a lot of attention to is sintering. It's this transformation that snowflakes go under as soon as they arrive on the land from the sky world. And it's not a melting process, it's a slow deformation where the kind of branches of their crystals round and they become bonded to each other. So if you're from a place where there is snow, usually when the snowstorm happens, the snow is really, really fluffy, and then it takes 24 to 48 hours for it to kind of settle and to settle into a snowpack. And that's when the snow becomes sintered. When the snow starts to melt in the spring, the sintered snow, the snowpack will stay on the trail a long time after the other unsintered snow melts. And so I started to think about this not in terms of grooming pretty quickly, but I started to think about this in terms of communities and relationships and solidarity, and about how this bonding to each other was a very important step, I think, in Indigenous resistance in the past. When I think of kind of my ancestors in the 1700s and the early 1800s, when they were engaging in organizing politically, they walked around and visited with other camps and other communities, often like a very far distance. They shared food, they got to know each other, they developed these bonds of trust. And I think that that's what those snowflakes were reminding me and were teaching me. And so I started to think of this, scientific process, Western scientific process of centering in a different way. And it spoke to me sort of in that moment, that being attentive to our relationships in political contexts when we're organizing, when we're thinking about things like solidarity, are a way of strengthening movements and strengthening our forms of resistance.
And am I right to think that the significance of sintering being different than melting, that the snowflake, while it's not exactly the same when it's centered versus uncentered. It is still remaining itself in some sense within the collective. So it's bringing something of itself rather than disappearing as part of joining. Is that
Yeah,
right?
that's right. And I think that that's a really important part that reminded me a lot of Anishinaabe political traditions where you can share territory and you can have separate sovereignties and separate jurisdictions where we think of beavers and moose as being nations that we share time and space with. So this sintering process, the snowflake is still a snowflake. It's in slightly different formation, but it's bonded to its neighbor in a way that doesn't destroy itself and it doesn't destroy its neighbor. And it's not a transformation like melting. It's not a complete change in form. It's a slight change in form.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, much of what Omar's book looks at is liberalism's relationship to fascism as an enabler of it, despite it seeing itself as an opposition to it, it often serving as a cover for it. And thinking of this, it feels like similar to your Land as Pedagogy essay, calling for a radical break from institutional education. The theory of water is calling for a radical break from the state or the nation state, and appeals to the state for recognition as the main mode of relationship to the state. And I was hoping, as a preface to us talking about this together, we could hear a section of Theory of Water that's sort of about this.
One early morning, while I was grooming the trail, I was thinking about sintering and listening to a podcast called Conjuncture. The episode, Against Pessimism, featured Robin D.G. Kelly, and in it, Robin spoke with Jordan T. Camp about a variety of topics coalescing around our present moment. Robin spoke about this moment that we all share, telling us that liberalism and fascism share the same goals: to shore up capitalism, maintain class and surplus, and keep the markets afloat. Sometimes, he said, fascism works better. At other times, liberalism. Fascism makes liberalism possible. I thought of Justin Trudeau wearing his reconciliation socks, embodying the idea that he is Indigenous people's best friends with his tattoo, the smudging, the big drum and blanket, the headdress. Meanwhile, he has whittled colonialism down to residential school abuses. He has paid the money and facilitated the Pope. I imagine Trudeau's team organizing Instagram posts of high tanning and powwow dancing, logging them into their database, and constructing a brand of indigeneity that is a good sell to white liberals and liberal Indigenous peoples alike. The anti-racist, multicultural fuel is what financial capital thrives on, as Kelly said to Camp. In another part of the podcast, Robin talked about Gramsci and his 1924 work Against Pessimism. Bracket, quote, I am trying to remember all of it, he said, although to me it seemed his mind held an astounding catalog of details. He talked about how Gramsci pushed back against Communist International and the historic moment when Italian communists facing Mussolini's fascist rise declared, quote, we have to withdraw, end quote. According to Gramsci, this was pessimism defined by fatalism, the idea that the crisis was coming, the economy was about to collapse, and that communists would just have to wait it out. Gramsci said, no, we need to act now. We can't wait. We need worker rebellions like the ones that occurred in Turin. Listening to this, I wrote down, this is where we are. We don't need to be defensive about anti-fascism, but active, engaged, and on the offensive. And, quote, masses of people in rebellion create the crisis, end quote. I thought about the past few years, a recent history that showed the precarity of life and also the calculations about who was worthy of living and who was assigned to perish. I thought of the never-ending crises and how it was easy, very easy for some of us to be disengaged, to just wait it out. I thought about what was happening that very day, which was the day after COP15 struck its historic deal to sacrifice 70% of the planet, the day the world waited for the January 6th panel to announce what we already knew, the day the Dutch Prime Minister performed an apology for the Netherlands' quote, historic role in the slave trade, unquote. I thought about the ongoing genocides in Gaza, the Sudan, Congo, and here I was listening to a thinker I deeply respected who compelled me, demanded even, to be active and on the offensive, who demanded that I fight, that we fight together. Kelly talked about Cedric Robinson's work as Black anti-fascism, and I thought about what Indigenous anti-fascism might look like, and Anishinaabe anti-fascism, Michisagik Anishinaabe anti-fascism. That is, I wondered what would it look like to have a critique of fascism from the formation of thought and perhaps a specific school of thought of the Michisagik Anishinaabe. What would it mean to have the sort of structuring and organizing that occurs outside what we usually imagine when we think of movements and anti-fascist writers and scholarship on these issues? What would it look like to have a school of thought that is largely embodied, that is oral, that has been under attack since contact, a school of thought that is difficult to propose, argue, and justify within the academy because it refuses the academy as an ethic, even as the academy cannot reproduce the sort of people who embody this sort of thinking, a kind of theory that is generated through continual practice, that is in constant motion. As if I was sitting beside him, perhaps visiting with him at the shore of a lake, I listened to Kelly tell Camp that Robinson's work in Black Marxism isn't really about racial capitalism. It is truly about Black revolt. Robinson, he said, traces the source of the ideologies of enslaved Black people to the beliefs, moralities, cosmologies, metaphysics, and intellectual traditions of the superstructures they were violently ripped from, not from the modes of production that they were forced to labor within. In this, I heard ways of thinking, epistemologies, ways of knowing, practices and ethics from indigenous peoples on the African continent. Kelly traced this influence forward in the Black radical tradition through the writings of Du Bois, C.L.R. James, and Richard Wright, a theory of Black radicalism that developed through what they found in the moments of Black masses. Listening to the podcast while grooming the trail led me to a moment of revelation. I have for a long time felt an affinity towards the Black feminists and the Black radical tradition, but also worried that this affinity was kind of a mining for knowledge and practice that I couldn't find in my own community. I stick on the words couldn't find in my own community as I write them because I know with certainty now that this is simply not true. There is an uncompromising, incommensurable critique of colonialism and capitalism from within Anishinaabe thought, and it not only formed the foundation of resistance for my ancestors, it is the catalyst for my own resistance. My ancestors, through embodied practice, physical and spiritual, and through our shared culture, although I cringe when I type that word because culture cannot stand in for all thought, theory, and practice, resisted, critiqued, and mobilized against capitalism from the time of contact with Europeans. Our fight is our critique. And as Robinson teaches us, rebellion is an embodied critique that can lead to intellectual traditions. In the case Robinson refers to the Black radical tradition. Indigenous peoples mobilized and lived otherwise because they had material and ethical imperatives to do so. And this ethical imperative came from the land and the waters and from their intimate relationships to these.
We've been listening to Leanne Betasamosake Simpson read from Theory of Water, Anishinaabe Maps to the Times Ahead. I've always felt sort of stuck at imagining what we replace the nation state with if we only look at pre-nation state examples within a European context, feudal kingdoms or princely fiefdoms are not particularly appealing or alluring alternatives to sort of mobilize around in my mind. But Theory of Water puts forth a vision which I think shares a lot of qualities with anarchism. No hierarchy or authoritarian power, no police, no coercion, and also an emphasis on mutual aid and solidarity horizontally. But one way an indigenous vision seems to me to differ from non-indigenous anarchism is that there actually is an authority or a superstructure or a law that one is beholden to. And of course, push back if I'm totally wrong on all of this, but and that superstructure or authority is nature. That nature is what negates the state. For instance, when you talk of water, you say water continually violates home spaces of everything on the planet, that it always escapes the container and also never gives up, which both seems to evoke a mode of resistance, but also a mode of harmonious coexistence. It seems like Robin D.G. Kelley is hinting at this in his blurb for your book when he says, Karl Marx wrote, "To be radical is to grasp the root of the matter. For him it is man." Leanne Betasamosake Simpson tells us that to be radical is to grasp the source of the matter, water. She is right, and shows us why in this poignant and poetic meditation on the power of water as life. The first victim of colonial capitalist exploitation, water is also the first line of defense and our most important site of recreation. If we are serious about decolonization, we need a theory of water. So his displacement of Marx's man with water and having a theory that decenters the human more broadly makes me think of you saying that your ancestors didn't build a world, but instead built a coalition with plant and animal life where they wove themselves within a world or centered themselves into an existing more than human fabric. Also, how you mentioned that in the North, the word people is not reserved for humans. And I realize I may be going astray or mischaracterizing all of this, but I was curious about your thoughts around this distinction that I'm making between, say, the European tradition of anarchism and how indigeneity both shares a lot of qualities with it and also perhaps has a significant distinction from it.
I think that my take on anarchism would be a grounded anarchism coming from grounded normativity, to use Glenn Coulthard's term that I sort of expanded on and as we've always done. Certainly some indigenous people, some Anishinaabe people would see the land or nature as the law or natural law. For me, when I think of the planet as being a collaboration made up of a diversity of ecologies and species and ways of knowing and ways of being, it becomes very, very complex very, very quickly, almost more complex than I think any one human or one living being can comprehend. And so we become interdependent upon each other because we all have a piece of the knowledge. We all have a piece of the practice. That's sort of the container, or that's the network within which we have to dream and build the alternatives. We have to figure out how to knit or weave or center ourselves into that existing ecology. But I don't see it as an authoritarian sort of entity, although it certainly can be. It's certainly, if you're not careful on the ice, you can fall through and lose your life. There are some endings because it's a powerful and complex system. But I see it as a belonging and I think of myself as a body, as a node in the network of creation. I am made up of the relationships that I'm in. I am made up of the relationships that I'm in, and that's the container. That's the authority, if you will. So I think it's a grounded authority, to use Shiri's term. And I think it dovetails and it's related to European traditions of anarchism, although I would say it's a grounded anarchism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, we have another question for you from another. This one is from Pass Between the Covers guest, Billy Ray Belcourt, who came on the show to discuss his amazing unclassifiable novel, A Minor Chorus, a novel he's sometimes referred to as auto theory. Since then, he has written the story collection Coexistence, of which author Claudia Day says, "This book is a feat of beauty and compression, every sentence reinventing the reader. It's like entering a quiet room or a secret lake. It's about our coexistence with lovers, kin, enemies, but also our coexistence with desire, solitude, and an intelligence that in itself is a form of hunger. Language is solace, language is light. Belcourt is the rare writer who composes from, to, and because of the soul. It's been some time since I loved a book so deeply." Here's a question for you from Billy Ray.
Hi, Leanne. Congratulations on your new beautiful book. My question is, so in the book, you write, "World making requires love, kindness, and care. It requires collectivity and relationality. And it is these practices that generate the knowledge needed to move on to the next step." I'm curious about when and under what conditions you first began engaging with the notion of world making. How did you arrive at the concept? Or in other words, what is your genealogy of world making? Thank you.
Another really great question. I've been thinking about world making for a very long time, but through the lens of these Anishinaabe origin stories. As a parent, I wanted my kids to grow up with as many stories from their culture that I could fit into them. And of course, kids are sponges for stories. And so they really led me into this body of oral stories around origins of different components of life. Anishinaabe people have at least four different origin stories for the making of the world, and some people say seven. And so after I sort of ran out of oral stories to tell my kids and family stories, then I started to look in archives and in, journals, anthropologists from the time of first contact, and trying to tell those stories not in a colonial sense, but decolonizing the versions that I was finding and telling them back into the context of my culture. So that's one kind of genealogy of that. The other part of that, I think, is doing this land-based work where you're constantly going out on the land with a different group of people led by elders, and you're building a mini community, and you're kind of doing it over and over and over again. And that led me to the realization that Anishinaabe life pre-colonially was a lot of making a continual embodiment of those creation stories, moving camp. Every season, every different land-based activity, you are engaged with a different set of living beings. In the sugar bush, you're working with maple trees. When you're harvesting wild rice, you're on the lake working with Minoman. And that really made me understand that world making isn't something that you just do when the current world falls apart. It's something that you do as a daily practice. And part of that daily practice is caretaking. Part of that daily practice is making good relationships, meaningful relationships, respectful relationships across difference. So it started to dawn on me that world making as a practice, as a way of being in the world, is something that I see Indigenous artists doing and holding on to. I see elders doing it, and I see movement people doing it in terms of solidarity. And so gaining skills in a your daily practice of life, of how to forge systems of care and understanding and meaning across difference, became, I think, a really powerful way of being in the world.
Well, thinking of genealogy, it's important to mention, I think, and you already have, your mentor, Doug, and how this book is in a way an homage to him and also an elegy for his passing. I think the part of the book that perhaps I think about the most is you retelling the story about Doug and the bullfrogs. And you talk about how much Doug loved to hunt bullfrogs, and not only how between 75 and 90% of the wetlands in southern Ontario have been destroyed, but how much of the land where one might hunt bullfrogs is a patchwork of private property owned by settlers, and how the tourist lodges are always surveilling native people trying to fish or hunt in any way, and how Doug ultimately decides to fight for his people's right to hunt bullfrogs in court. And in the end, he wins this right legally. But even though going forward with this long legal battle to gain this right, I think is evidence of his love of this activity. Once he achieved the right to hunt bullfrogs, he would never kill one, not even a single bullfrog, because the frogs were so beleaguered as a nation. This, to me, more than anything in the book, helped me to understand, I think, what it means to knit oneself into a world that's not just a human world. So, the grounded anarchism, alongside plants and animals with mutual consent and mutual aid. I don't even know that this is a question, but I wondered if it sparked thoughts, because this dynamic, this assertion of rights, but then also a recognition of the health or the lack thereof of this other nation, and the impact those rights, if executed, would have on them, seems like this really great encapsulation of something that you're reaching towards in Theory of Water.
I remember really clearly, probably 10 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, probably both, asking Doug to take me back to that lake to canoe and to hunt bullfrogs, because the way that they hunted bullfrogs was pretty unique. And not all Anishinaabe ate frogs and snakes. And one of the reasons why my people were eating them was because of the Williams Treaty. It wasn't really a treaty, it was a trick and a fraudulent endeavor. But if you think of it as a treaty, it was the only treaty in Canada that took away our hunting and fishing rights. And so my people had to exist for almost 100 years, not being able to have access to our traditional economy and our traditional food, which meant our people were forced into sort of a state of poverty. I remember my grandmother eating things like porcupines and squirrels, and talking to Doug about this, he was like, well, I was always wondering why my people weren't eating moose and deer and like the cool things. And he explained to me it was because of this. It's because we had to figure out ways of feeding ourselves out of the eyes, out of the surveillance of the game wardens. And so I, as a form of resistance, really wanted to learn how to hunt bullfrogs. And I wanted to reenact this. And he said, no, like, I would love to teach you that, but we can't do that because the frogs are are struggling so much right now. And so that was a very important lesson to me, because that would have been a beautiful day, right? Like, that would have been a really, I think, a way of sort of honoring the struggle that Doug had gone through in getting arrested and taking this to court and fighting and winning this very important case that then brought our knowledge into the legal system as evidence. So, but it also was like that that has to take back seats, because our first responsibility is caring for those bullfrogs. Mm. And they're not in a position where they can lose anybody right now.
Well, in Theory of Water, you talk about how overlapping worlds, like shorelines where land and water meet, or estuaries where fresh and salt water meet, are places that teem with diversity, and also that they are places of regeneration. It reminds me of something that the poet Jory Graham said about trees, that they are most present at the place they are most extended, at the tips of their branches, at the zone of encounter. And we could contrast these overlapping zones to the 42 locks on the Trent Severn system of waterways in Ontario, which end up devastating it by separating everything. And I also think of Robert Macfarlane in his new book, Is a River Alive? In a section called Drowning a River, he talks about how Quebec, since the 1880s, has been converted into a vast electrical machine, that Hydro-Quebec is the world's fourth largest producer of hydropower in the world, and the 2011 Plan Nord to industrialize the far north, one of the largest intact ecosystems in the world, where 14 of the 16 large rivers are already now dammed, and where labor camps that include gyms and supermarkets and more are set up deep within the boreal forest. I also think about your work across books and across many of your talks when I think of diversity of strategy, diversity of mode of being, perhaps like the different animals on the back of the turtle. For instance, in commemorating 22 years of the Grassy Narrows blockade, you say the blockade is modeled after the work of the beaver. Quote, "It is a refusal of everything that destroys life, from pulp mill effluent and mercury contamination to deforestation and mining, to climate catastrophe and nuclear waste dumping. And it is more than a refusal. For 22 years, the land and water protectors at Grassy Narrows have been showing the world that there are ways of living within the network of life that are based on deep reciprocity. Their perseverance, resistance, and profound love for their land is a beacon of hope for me." And similarly, in talking about your beaver-centric book, A Short History of the Blockade, you talk about blockades as both a negation and an affirmation, and that unlike the beaver in the colonial imaginary as a sort of industrious engineer, beavers are the practice of wisdom. You talk of their waterproof fur, webbed feet, third eyelid, how their deep pools and channels drought-proof the landscape and also provide cooling stations, that they're a builder of shared worlds, worlds that bring water, that in pre-colonial North America there were up to 400 million beavers in every stream. And then I think of the raccoons in your book, No Piming, which you describe as the ultimate radicals. Quote, "Sure, they had been dispossessed, displaced, and their habitat gentrified like everyone else, but they were not taking it. No way. They moved the fuck back in, committed, built lodges, spoke their language, did their ceremonies, and took care of each other. They had kids and more kids and raised them up to be self-determining fire. They figured out how to live with the asshat humans in harmony, such that the biggest asshat human complaint was that they had to clean up their garbage every few days." I'm not sure if this is what you mean by diversity, the beaver mode and the raccoon mode, or the debate in No Piming between the resident and migratory geese. But talk to us about this aspect of theory of water. What diversity, such a word that's been emptied of meaning in the common Western imaginary, this question of diversity, what diversity is and means for you in creating coalitions and resisting erasure?
I think that I've been taking an expansive approach to diversity, and I think within Anishinaabe thought, diversity is seen as something that's very necessary and very good, and that comes from nature, that comes from the land. You look at a forest, and it's a fantastically diverse place made up of all kinds of different plants, trees, shrubs, insects, animals, birds, fish. It's a cascading entity that's a network made up of all of these different species that have figured out a way of working together to bring forth more life. And I think there's limits to that. And so I think in my work I've sort of put this boundary, like I'm going to refuse colonialism. I'm going to refuse racial capitalism. I'm going to refuse heteropatriarchy. Those are the refusals. And now I'm going to work within the rest of the world to come up with something that's different, that's a radical imagining out of that, that's a worlding that is collaborative and therefore not just Anishinaabe centric and not just Leanne centric, but it's a way of generating, I think, relationships that are modeled after this expansive network that is our planet. I think that that's, for me, a generative space to exist in. And in terms of solidarity, I think of that. I remember in Idle No More, we had lots of conversations about how to forge solidarity with Canadians and with non-Indigenous people that we needed as allies and that we needed as support. And that shift now for me is, okay, like I'm going to put that boundary up again where I'm refusing capitalism, I'm refusing heteropatriarchy, I'm refusing those worlds. And I want to invest in relationships with anti-colonial movements and with people who are also radically imagining their way out of fascism. And I think that creating constellations of coexistence, constellations of mutual aid, that can be a place of learning and of fostering the skills that we need to rehearse these different forms of living and ways of life.
Do you have any thoughts about holding a space for diversity of opinion within a functioning coalition? So you've already said the no's, right? Because I think of, your people are joint stewards of the land with your neighbors, the Haudenosaunee, but also think about how, particularly online, it feels like there's this immense pressure exerted on language to get everyone to adopt the same analysis and the same vocabulary, or else you're like flipped out of or thrown out of the group. But I also think about this series of episodes on the Dig podcast about the history of Arab organizing and radicalism and resistance. And this I don't remember the guest's name, an Arab scholar and historian, talking about these, what he considered huge strategic errors where, say, one group is like hardcore Marxist and the other group is Marxist light. And the differences seem absolute and vital and essential in the heat of the moment, to the point where they don't join up, or they are having friction with each other in a way that sort of takes their eye off of who the real oppressive power is at a time when you can absolutely not afford to do so. I mean, partly I was also thinking about, I was listening to the head of Jewish Currents magazine, Ariel Angel, talking about how it's vital to be doing all of this organizing offline in shared activity. So like I think back to like you being away from the screen, but also think back to theory as something kinetic. I mean, maybe some of these things that are happening mediated virtually in a disembodied space become so polarizing and binary because they're happening in that context. But I wondered if you had any more thoughts about, in the moment, these differences seem huge, but then you look back on history, like on this podcast, and you're like, wow, like these two people should be facing the same direction, and then figure that difference out way farther down the line.
Yeah, that's a fabulous series that the Dig did with Abdel Razak Takridi, the Arab scholar. And so I think, yes, I agree that we need to skill up in terms of relating to each other across our differences, particularly differences that are fairly minor, right? And I think that that's what Robin and I were trying to do in Rehearsals for Living, because there have been tensions between the Indigenous community and the Black community in the academy, not so much in organizing, but we wanted to sort of take a very intentional approach to relating to each other, to sharing in a way that was respectful and that was mutually reciprocal, but that didn't shy away from some of the more difficult conversations, as a practice and as a way of skilling up, having those conversations and respecting that our movements are different, but they are linked. And so making space for difference and also finding ways of linking, I think are important in broadening anti-colonial movements and developing the kinds of larger scale solidarities that we need to face what we're facing right now. And so I think that internally we have a lot of work to do in that regard. And I know that there's lots of organizers who are doing workshops and putting a lot of energy into figuring out how to work through conflict in a way that's generative and that strengthens movements and strengthens relationships rather than causes more harm.
Thinking of your moment of insecurity that you ultimately reject in relation to Black feminism and what your own tradition offers in the section that you read for us, you express something similar in your essay about Indigenous solidarity with Palestine, an essay called A Blow to the Snake here, where after two of your Palestinian hosts were describing their many-year battle for access to their village's spring, you say, quote, "Listening to Ahed and Bassem, I caught myself feeling ashamed, worried that at home we had gotten so tied up in treaty promises, royal commissions, national inquiries, reconciliation, that too many of us stopped fighting, worried that too many of us now live comfortable middle-class lives in cities or on the reserve and do little more than activism, worried that somehow in our emphasis on post-secondary education, we had confused credentialism with a liberatory project, and now we have a lot of degrees and access to the middle class and little else. Worried that maybe Indigenous struggles had very little to offer Palestinians in terms of solidarity. Palestinian resistance has revealed the smoke and mirrors of reconciliation." But you then go on to roundly reject your shame and describe in a deep way the Indigenous resistance that is happening. But thinking about this question of diversity in the struggle and that the power of regeneration occurs alongside and or because of the diversity in the overlapping areas of difference, I wonder about those of us from peoples who don't have the stories, histories, or praxis of right relation to the land that Indigenous people do, and perhaps also haven't developed the liberatory theory and praxis of the Black radical tradition. I'm thinking of Americans and Canadians who are immigrants and refugees, whether Latinx, Asian, Arab, Muslim, or Jewish, who, regardless of the reason of our arrival, whether simply seeking opportunity or fleeing war or violence, we are nonetheless slotted into a settler position that is both often anti-Black and doesn't acknowledge or engage with stolen land. It feels like there's something generous, even loving, in your expressing your insecurity, as it feels to me like one thing it provides is an opportunity to wonder out loud how non-Indigenous, non-Black peoples can weave ourselves into a struggle in a way that isn't extractive. I think of your meditation on elite capture in Theory of Water, how non-Indigenous researchers and environmental activists see the inclusion of your work and other Indigenous peoples as making their work more ethical and robust, but how in the way it gets reduced and framed and captured in the process, it ultimately recasts the work in a counter-liberatory way, that regardless of intentions, the impression of collaboration is a means to disrupt real Indigenous resistance. This is sort of my long way of asking both about your thoughts about a diverse coalition of people who don't have the practices, don't have the stories, wanting to take steps towards being woven in, and what that might look like, and what the distinction is in your own work that you say you've moved away from non-Indigenous allies and instead towards organizers, scholars, and thinkers engaged in the struggle for liberation.
I think I've moved away from trying to get white people to be allies to Indigenous movements to asking myself, how are you, Leanne? How are you in solidarity with Palestine and Palestinian people? How are you in solidarity with this global movement for Black lives? And that has been very, very powerful. And it links back, I think, to the section in the book where I'm talking about Madeline Wheatong's work in Curve Lake. She's describing growing up with her grandfather, Clifford Wheatongue, in his garden. And this is coming from her PhD dissertation. And she's talking about how we learn accountability at the shore. And it's not a big public shaming or an internet call out. It's a practice of self-reflection, first and foremost, where you're constantly looking inside yourself and thinking, asking yourself, these questions of accountability. It's not something that you're going to outsource to the people that you're in community with. You try to be responsible for the areas that you in your life that you don't know very much about, the things that you wish you didn't, the mistakes that you made. And so one of the ways I think that I have been learning about solidarity and learning about how to foster relationships across difference is by thinking and acting with these other movements that have been doing such incredibly important work, even though there hasn't been maybe a large-scale indigenous mobilization since Standing Rock. So asking myself and asking the circles that I'm a part of, what are we doing to materially support the anti-colonial movements that right now are mobilized and need our help? And so that shift was beautiful and really important, I think, for me.
Well, earlier this year, I took an 8-week course with an Australian psychotherapist and organizer, Leah Avenay, on collective recovery from what she calls colonial fragmentation disorder. Her family is from Tuvalu and from Ireland, from two Indigenous bloodlines, but even as she holds a research position as the Indigenous pedagogy lead at the Willan Center for Indigenous Arts and Cultural Development and works under the mentorship of Indigenous Australian teachers, she is a settler and presents herself as such. But what we worked through together as a group had to do with narrative recovery through practices of place, body, and story, and also shaping a field of being that moves from a disfigured relationship to the land to a dignified relationship with the land. And part of that was honoring one's own ancestors and bloodline from elsewhere. But part of it was learning about and engaging with the stories and histories and peoples of the place where we are, wherever that is. And, through this practice, I shamefully am just learning about how Portland wasn't a place before colonial settlement where people lived as much as it was a great wetland where the Kalapuyan people came to forage and hunt, that it was a place abundant in beaver and duck, which now are mainly thought of as our two main football mascots, rather than a creature you would come across moving through the world on a given day, and how these wetlands were filled in with earth and rock and trash, and many of the streams and creeks and springs, which were all over Portland, pre-Portland, were buried beneath the earth so that the city could be built without considering them. But thinking of these people gathering with Leah, mainly from different parts of Australia, but also some people from India and from Canada and the US, it made me think of my conversation with Alexis Wright, the most celebrated Aboriginal writer, and how she described Aboriginal culture as cosmopolitan. She makes a distinction between cosmopolitan and assimilationist. To her, it meant a culture that was open and open to influence, but without losing one's own vantage point, which sort of feels a little bit like centering. I think of how you speak in this book and other books about Indigenous internationalism. For instance, in Rehearsals of Living, you talk about a politic of sharing, a, quote, continual divestment of individuality and a perpetual deepening of the communal, a politic that's anti-accumulation and intertwined with a politic of caring. And likewise in the same book, how water insists on internationalism, on seeing ourselves outside of our own perspectives, which I really like. And one of the stories you tell related to this is about the history of the eel, which used to be extremely abundant in inland Canada. And I was hoping, if you have any thoughts about anything I just shared, I'd love to hear them. But I'd also would love to hear about the eel and about the eel in relationship to perhaps an idea of internationalism.
Yeah, so my homeland is roughly the North Shore of Lake Ontario. And so Doug and I were out. I can't remember. I think we were hunting for geese in the fall in a canoe, and he was talking about eels. And he was remembering, I guess, the spot that we were in. He remembered being there as a kid, and the lake was teeming with eels. And I was like what? Like, what do you like? What kind of eels? What's going on? And he explained how before the Trent Severn waterway and the lift flocks, also on the St. Lawrence River, that eels traveled in large numbers into our territory and into our lakes from the Sargasso Sea. And so that became an interesting thing for me to consider because there are very, very few eels in my territory now. I had trouble finding even our word for eels. I had trouble finding eel stories because they've been so decimated. Yet he had this kind of just thread of knowledge about it from his childhood, and he would have been alive just at the very end of eels in our territory, and that showed me this cycling and seasonality of Anishinaabe life, where different seasons, our nation was composed of different nations and different beings. There was a lot of movement, there was a lot of cycling. The eels would come in the spring with knowledge of what was happening in the Sargasso Sea based on how healthy they were. And they would spend their time with us, and then they would make that connection and make that journey back. So I started to think about my homeland, not as the way that I had been taught by colonial society, as this piece of land that we, fight over with the Haudenosaunee in terms of where the boundaries are, where my nation is not a nation state. And it's a collection of very deep relationships that extend across great distances in time and space and connect to everything on the planet. And that's a very, very different way of looking at a nation than this Westphalian nation state with borders that you defend. So the eel was really the species that I think I learned that from. And I started to see, once I learned that kind of eel story and that history, I started to see Anishinaabe internationalism everywhere.
Well, thinking about both how water violates home spaces, crosses borders, connects distant places, and how it overlaps, producing more life and a diversity of life. I wanted to ask you about your writing in relation to your other forms of art making. For instance, how you see your book, Theory of Water, in relation to your album, Theory of Ice, or the album, Theory of Ice, in relation to the Theory of Ice section in your novel, No Piming, or how the song on Theory of Ice, called Failure of Melting, is also the name of a poem in No Piming, whose narrator lies frozen in ice. I also think of when I think of different modes of representation, the tree in that book is itself reading the book, The Hidden Life of Trees. But talk to us about the overlaps and cross-pollinations and divergences between how certain themes or questions find themselves in these different artistic containers.
Sometimes I think that I'm just writing Dancing on Our Turtle's Back over and over and over again, and it's just that like my knowledge is deepening, and I'm working with the same origin stories, the same teachings, the same land-based practices, but my knowledge is deepening, and the world is changing, and so the books are changing. But I think ultimately I love making music. I love writing fiction. I love writing nonfiction. And so whenever I get an idea, I work with it, I think, in different genres and across different disciplines as a way of deepening my understanding and teaching my own self. And that kind of creates all of these crossovers between between projects. I think Theory of Water was really born in that last letter to Robin Maynard, where I start to think about the kinds of issues that Robin and I have been discussing, but outside of the Black and Indigenous community now, like in a more expansive way. But then I also draw on the work that I was doing musically in Theory of Ice. And music is interesting because lyrics are a kind of poetry that is in collaboration with the voices of different instruments and different musicians. But you often, when you put out a record, you generally go on tour and you do shows, and there's a repetition, there's a rehearsal where you're saying these words and singing these songs over and over and over and over and over again to different audiences. And in those rehearsals, I think I am also thinking of the ideas that I'm working with in the lyrics and in the songs. And so that becomes a generative spot for, like the 500th time I'm singing a certain song, like I'm on this ski trail or I'm out for a run or I'm grooming, the light bulb will go off and I'll make a connection that I haven't made before. And that will sort of work its way into the next book or record. And so I'm also often I work on one thing at a time, but like the hard work of the first draft, I will only be working on one thing for that, but then I will be mixing a record at the same time or editing fiction. So it's also kind of all crossed over that way. I think that I'm not trying to, break open genres or disciplines. I'm just trying to do what I do, or maybe what I can do. And it comes out in a way that doesn't fit into the containers of the Western world very, very well.
Before we end, and perhaps as a way to bring things to an end, it feels important that we talk about maps, given the subtitle, Anishinaabe Maps to the Time Ahead. What maps are and are not in this way of being. Some mentions of maps of yours include, quote, "The vision for the future is not a fixed map, but a set of ethical practices." Or how the creation stories, quote, "tell us there was no map, no research plan, no set of strategies. There was no land and no leader, just love and hope and a fostering of emergence." You talk about the eel's body as a map, much like a tree trunk is a map. But thinking of water again, one thing that stuck with me is you talk about how fresh water is less than 3% of the total water on the planet, but that only 0.3% of the 3% is lakes, rivers, and swamps, that almost all of it is either frozen in ice caps and glaciers or beneath the surface in groundwater. Thinking about all of this unseen water makes me think of your section in the book called Maps to Statelessness, a type of map that isn't of a fixed position in space, but a map of relationship and presence. And how you say if you were to make a map of your territory, it would be a song. So I was hoping you could talk about space and time in relation to maps, but also about two meditations on maps you make in the book. One is your video contribution to the 20th anniversary celebration of Dion Brand's Map to the Door of No Return, which I will point supporters to because it's a really incredible video called Pinery Road in Concession 11, which feels very much about the impossibility of spatial navigation in a colonial setting. So I was hoping maybe you could talk about maps and then about that video, and then maybe we could go out with a reading of the book about the map on the back of the turtle as a counterbalance.
I wanted to trouble and undo this idea of what a map is in Western societies and colonial societies, because the map makers, would come to our territories. They would need a map from the indigenous guide in order to get to the next territory, very early on in the first contact. And then sort of mapping became the first step to converting our homelands into property. So I wanted to sort of look at maps as in a different in a different way. Anishinaabe people orient their maps from the east to the west because that's how we traveled. And because I think culturally we don't just map topography, but we are mapping topology, or we're mapping relationships. And so how is a black ash basket a map? Well, you're taking the tree rings, which is a recording of weather and conditions of life of a tree, and you're weaving it together to make something else. And so starting to see meaning in things that you might think of as an object, like a mat made out of cattails or a basket made out of black ash trees, and seeing how that's actually a recording or a mapping of relationships. And so then you get to tree trunks and eels. And that's sort of a switch in orientation from seeing the land as a commodity to consume and to extract, to seeing the land as a potentiality for belonging and a potentiality to develop relationships. And so I wanted to switch that orientation and undo that, the way that maps are used as tools. So maybe we can think of maps as tools towards belonging, towards centering, towards deepening our relationality, and use that as a foundation for building rather than the topography approach, which is the mapping of the land to turn it into property to extract resources to fuel capitalism. Yeah.
Could we hear the section called Mapping and Unmapping?
Yes. Mapping and unmapping. When Sky Woman, Kishigo Kwe, came to the ocean world a second time to try to make a new world, she found a kind of map on the back of the turtle. It wasn't a map that documented property or borders or topography. It didn't show a route. It wasn't even instructional. It was a map that made visible the nature of time itself. It showed 13 full moons in the 13 sections that make up the core of the shell. It showed the 28 phases of each moon around the edge of the shell as an influential organizing force. It made visible movement and transformation and flux, and it made visible the work of the night sun, work that went beyond lighting the night sky. The map was presented as a resting place, as a material answer for those who were undrowned to the problem of finding such a place in oceans of water. Because of the map, Gijigokwe stopped searching for the route to the new world and looked inside herself to make a crucial connection. The insight that was the missing essence in Jouet Manido's initial attempt at world making was cycling and spiraling and returning again and again. The missing essence was renewal and reciprocity. The turtle shell was a map to nowhere and a map to the whole world. The map on the snapping turtle's back is not a two-dimensional drawing of the assets of colonial thought and life. It is not a grid on white paper or white screens tracing a route through history and development from the savage to the civilized. The turtle shell map is like the sunrise. It is a visual mapping of the collapsing past and future, giving birth to the present. It is a reminder. If I were to make a map of my territory, it would be a song. Song begins inside me. It is a kind of wrestling to articulate the incompleteness of what is inside me, using my poor understanding of my body as instrument and breathing to fuel that instrument. The sound would originate in me and travel. There would be seen and unseen parts. It would be a fleeting record of a series of relationships in the cycling of time. It would lead nowhere and everywhere. If I were to draw a map of my territory, it would be a series of fine, unlinear lines moving in every direction on the page and into the page, through the page and around the page. There would be so many lines. My map would look like a single homogeneous color of whatever ink I started with. The density would grow with each trip I make around the sun until the paper gives way, ruptured, and I am left still drawing. If I were to draw a map of my territory, I would have to start at the beginning with the sound of corn in a turtle rattle and my heartbeat. If I were to draw a map of my territory, I would have to start inside the otolith of a salmon from the lake and then with the mucus of an eel newly arrived with news of the Sargasso Sea. I would add the migration route across the lake for the birds on their way south and then north. I would add the migration route inside the lake for fish. If I were to draw a map of my territory, the page would be blank with all the life and lives and living that go into the making of paper from trees and water and sunlight, all the lives and living that go into my existence that I don't know. This morning, at the end of this world, I ask myself what I would give up to bring into being a different world, to change the air, to change everything. I theoretically sort through precious things to see which ideas are brick walls and which are doorways. I think of the snapping turtle shell design, and I think about all of the maps I'm missing, even though they are right in front of me. The maps all around us, the ones on the backs of turtles.
Thank you, Leanne. This is the conversation I've been anticipating the most all year. And this book, Theory of Water, is the one I will be gifting to people that I want to be centering with going forward. Thank you.
Well, miigwech, this has been a really wonderful conversation, and it's the first conversation on this book, so it feels really good to be able to connect with you through it.
Yeah.
And it was so meaningful to hear Omar and Alexis and Billy Ray. So I was like choking back tears, but that was really lovely. So thank you for that.
We've been talking today to Leanne Betasamosake Simpson about Theory of Water, Anishinaabe Maps to the Times Ahead. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength makeshift home office of me, David Naiman. You can find more of Leanne's work at leannesimpson.ca. If you enjoyed today's conversation, consider joining the Between the Covers community as a listener supporter. Every supporter can join our brainstorm of future guests, and every listener supporter receives supplementary resources with each and every conversation. Of things I discovered while preparing, things referenced during the conversation, and places to explore once you're done listening. And there are also many other things to choose from on top of these. There's the immense and ever-growing bonus audio archive, where Leanne gives us a sneak peek of a song from her upcoming album, Live Like the Sky, joining contributions from Dion Brand, Christina Sharp, Nikki Finney, Natalie Diaz, Isabella Hamad, Layli Longsoldier, Omar El Akkad, and many others. There's also, just to name a few, the 10 House Early Readership subscription, getting 12 books over the course of a year, months before they're available to the general public, rare collectibles from past guests, a bundle of books selected and curated by me and sent to you, and much more. You can find out about it all at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Or if you prefer a one-time donation, you can do so by PayPal at tinhouse.com/support. I'd like to thank the Tin House team, Elisa Ogie in the book division, Beth Steidel in the art department, Becky Kramer in publicity, and Lance Cleland, the director of the summer and winter Tin House Writers Workshops. Finally, I'd like to thank past Between the Covers guest, poet, musician, composer, filmmaker, performer, and much more. Alicia Jo Rabins for making the intro and outro for the show. You can find out more about her work, her writing, her music, her film, her teaching at aliciajo.com. ALICIAJO.com.